Welcome to session 2. It's fantastic to hear such great conversation going on around the room, and I congratulate the speakers in the earlier sessions to have generated such a buzz. That's fantastic. My name is Pattison, and I've got the pleasure of being the moderator for this session. I'm going to make a few introductory remarks, introduce the speakers, we'll then speak in turn, and we're hoping to leave a good time for questions and discussion. But in this session, we're going to broaden our perspective somewhat on the human brain. We've been inside it and in its early phases for quite a while, but we're going to seek to understand here how brain, mind and well-being it develops and how to understand it in its social, cultural and environmental context. The evolution of the human brain has often been linked to the increasing social complexity of human life, and a number of studies have made intriguing linkages between our complex socio-cultural world and characteristics of the human brain. For example, it's now well known that specialised brain networks support some very human capabilities, such as recognising human faces, learning human languages, as we heard this morning, visually analysing the physical environment and imitating the behaviours of others. And as a social scientist interested in the role of the social environment in shaping opportunities and constraints for human action, I find some of the connections that have been made between features of the brain and characteristics of an individual social network especially interesting. For example, the size of individual social networks has been found to be related to the volume of their amygdala. White matter connectivity in brain regions supporting social and affective processing have also been related to characteristics of an individual's position in their social network, including how central they are in the network and their potential capacity to broker connections with others. If replicated, studies such as these provide an avenue for investigating how our brains shape and are shaped by the real social networks we inhabit. The recent pandemic provided a shock to our everyday socio-cultural and environmental contexts in most parts of the world, limiting movement and interpersonal interaction, as well as access to economic opportunities. Some ongoing studies took advantage of this natural experiment to explore the impacts of this sudden change on brain, mind and well-being. In a study in Israel, for example, Salomon and colleagues documented temporary volumetric changes during lockdown in the amygdala and other related brain areas. In another natural experiment conducted as part of the long-running Mannheim study of children at risk, whose participants are now in their early 30s, Moninger and colleagues used momentary assessments of mood across the course of a week to record a mood-lifting impact of positive real-life social interactions, with the size of the relationship dependent on the level of amygdala activity measured pre-pandemic. Interestingly, but perhaps not surprisingly, no corresponding effect on mood was found for online social interactions. I think we can all relate to that. These kinds of results link phenomena at vastly different scales and raise many more questions than they answer, as Lucy mentioned this morning, for so much of what we're seeking to understand about the brain, including the nature of explanation itself when it comes to linking what's happening in one complex system, like the brain, with those in another, like the socio-cultural worlds we inhabit. And to delve more deeply into the interplay between brain, mind and well-being and its socio-cultural and environmental context, we have a wonderfully diverse panel who will offer in turn psychiatric, economic, urban planning, linguistic and philosophical perspectives. So settle in, we're going broad. Our first speaker is Professor Andrew Chanen, Chief of Clinical Practice at Orygen and an expert on prevention and early intervention for severe mental disorders, especially personality disorders. Next up, we'll have a short video presentation from the Honourable Dr. Andrew Leigh, Member for Fenner and Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities, Treasury and Employment, and a former Professor of Economics at ANU. Our third speaker is Dr. Jennifer Kent, a DECRA Fellow and Urbanism expert from the University of Sydney, who works at the intersection of urban planning, transport and health. The fourth speaker is Professor Jackie Troy, Director of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research at the University of Sydney and an expert on the documentation and revival of Indigenous languages. The final speaker is Professor David Braddon-Mitchell, also of the University of Sydney, and he's a philosopher with expertise in the philosophy of mind and cognitive science, including consciousness. Each of our panelists will talk for about 10 to 12 minutes, and this will hopefully leave plenty of time for comments and questions from the audience. So please now welcome our first speaker, Professor Andrew Chanen.
Thank you very much, Pip. Thank you very much for inviting me to present today. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on Gadigal land and to acknowledge any First Nations people who might be present today and also to thank them for their custodianship of the land. I'm going to talk about, and I just look for my clicker, I'm going to try to describe the interaction between ourselves and our environment in terms of personality development and what can go wrong. I'm very mindful of speaking before a philosopher and talking about the self, and I think we might have a very interesting debate about that. But what I want to describe to you is how the notion of personality and personality disorder has developed over time, and to describe some of the controversies around this issue of how we develop as people. So just to let you know my declarations. And so when we think about personality, there's a very simple way of thinking about it. It's what makes us who we are. But it essentially describes our characteristic ways of behaving, experiencing life, perceiving and interpreting ourselves, and other people, of course, and the environment within which we exist. And it's relatively stable over time and situations. And I think people would hopefully see that as a reasonably acceptable common definition. It gets a little more complex than that, though, because I think Dan McAdams describes it very nicely, that it's a layered concept. There are essentially three layers. We are born with dispositional temperaments, which he describes as ourselves as a social actor. Then we adapt to our environment, and I'll talk a bit more about this, as a motivated agent. And then we form a narrative identity over the top of that, which binds those two layers together into what we recognise as ourselves. And I won't go into all the detail on these slides, but just to highlight that dispositional traits are the basic biological individual differences that we are born with, and that they're linked to underlying neural networks, and they show strong similarities to the structure of temperament in other animal species as well. And this genotypic self, this self that we're endowed with when we are born, is predisposed to and capable of intersubjectivity. And there are lovely experiments looking at infant development straight after birth, showing the intersubjectivity of human infants. But at this stage, we don't have the reflective capacity in our relational environment. Oh, I just did something terrible there. So layer 2 is where the temperamental traits that we have become transformed through reciprocal interaction with the environment into what we would think of in common language as personality traits. And they're essentially the same in content and structure, but they're broader. We have a wider repertoire of traits, and there is a large body of research that has largely settled on what are called the Big Five. 5 basic higher order dispositions. There is some discussion that there are 2 factors that sit above that, but that's probably not so helpful for our discussion. And essentially they're about openness to experience, or our intellect, our conscientiousness, extroversion, which essentially is capacity for positive emotionality, agreeableness, which is as it says, and neuroticism, which is very important for mental health, which describes propensity for negative emotionality. But traits are largely descriptive. They don't describe us as human beings, and where the debate is at in the field at the moment is a lot of trait psychologists would say traits are enough to describe a person. I think there is a great deal of dissent around that they don't capture the complexity of what it is to be a human being. And so characteristic adaptations, as McAdams describes it, encompasses the motivational, social, cognitive and developmental adaptations that are specific to our time and place, where we exist. They start to develop around the age of 5 to 7, and with increasing cognitive capacity, children begin to link their, to have goals and to link these with motives and behaviours. They continue to influence our personality functioning, but what really is the decisive ingredient is the changes that happen around puberty that allow us to develop reflective capacity and develop a narrative identity. And this is where we actively integrate life experiences into an internalised, evolving narrative of ourselves with a sense of unity and purpose in life. And it requires coherence of time, biography, cause and thematic coherence as well. But the cognitive mechanisms that we require to develop this don't really develop until puberty. So what could possibly go wrong in the development of human beings? Well, some of you might be old enough to recognise this, and I took the Sydney Morning Herald rather than the Melbourne Age version of this headline. This is Gary David, who was a notorious prisoner in the 1980s and who sadly died in the early 90s. And there was a huge debate around his offending about personality disorder. Was it a mental illness? The glib kind of aphorism, was he mad or bad? That really captured, I think, the debate at the time. And he suffered terribly in life, but was portrayed as an aggressor. And even if you look in Wikipedia now, it'll say he died by suicide by ingesting razor blades. Actually, death was really an artefact of his self-harm. So this is at the most extreme form of personality disorder. And one thing that's really changed, and I think society as a kind of barometer of the way we perceive personality disorder, is that there have been a number of judgments recently that have taken personality disorder to be a mitigating factor in sentencing. Cody Herman is one of the well-known cases. I had involvement with two of the other relatively recent cases. And it actually says that his personality disorder reduced his moral culpability for the murder. Again, another young woman, Dahlia Brown, it's on the record, so I'm not breaching confidence that she was under care. And again, her fire setting, which nearly killed a large number of people, was the only way that she could have control in her life. And I think this really sums up the shift where a number of people who testified in another case, Andy Carroll, who's a forensic psychiatrist, said that, described to the court that this is among the most disturbing of all disorders. And Jim Ogloff, a very eminent forensic psychologist, said, I'd rather have schizophrenia than have borderline personality disorder. I think that represents a substantial shift in the way that we see personality disorder. So what is personality disorder? Well, it's when our personality structure prevents us from achieving adaptive solutions to life's universal tasks, having a stable and integrated sense of ourselves and other people, and being able to have the capacity for intimacy, attachment, affiliation, pro-social behaviour and cooperative relationships. It is a developmental disorder, and it's not been thought of as a developmental disorder hitherto. And it only becomes observable when people develop the capacity for what's called metacognition, thinking about thinking, being able to reflect upon oneself. And it's this disturbance of that narrative identity that is fundamental to what is personality disorder. These are some lay descriptions that we developed as part of a study. And I won't go through all the detail except to show you that it ranges from mild, and you will know many people in your life who have mild personality disorder, where someone might have an unrealistically high or low sense of worth, experience difficulties in conflict in relationships, in setting goals, whatever it might be, right through to severe, the Gary David type experience of someone who experiences extreme self-hatred or extreme inflation of self-esteem. I won't talk about any former presidents, but you might want to extrapolate. And someone who has no sense of purpose in life, cannot engage effectively, and people with severe personality disorder live very lonely and isolated and often very unhappy lives. And I'll show you why in just a minute. So essentially we've turned McAdam's model with my colleague Carla Sharp and also Sunabo from Denmark into a model of personality pathology development. Essentially it takes the same model but overlays abnormal development, where you might begin with dispositional traits that are not in and of themselves pathological. Everybody knows irritable children or children who are overly adventurous. And that non-reflexive genotypic self, through reciprocal interaction with the environment, especially the caregiving environment, then develops goals and values and motives, and by about 5 to 7 years of age, certain behaviours are not tolerated within group settings. You have to take your turn, you're not allowed to steal other kids' toys, etc., etc. And so these problematic behaviours are not personality disorder, they are problematic behaviours. But they begin to be in the mental health realm, and I think you've probably heard a bit about that this morning in terms of, I unfortunately couldn't see Adam's presentation, but when early development goes awry. But this sense of self at this stage is piecemeal and rudimentary, and puberty brings this transition that then facilitates this layer 3, the self as author. And it's really only now that personality disorder becomes apparent. And this phenotypic self integrates and binds abnormal traits, and the organising structure of the self becomes disrupted at this stage. And that's what leads to the development of personality disorder, which might wax and wane. Someone might have functional periods, but it breaks down usually under social stressors. And personality disorder is essentially construed as a self and relational disorder. Relational problems are the source of the disorder, as opposed to disorders of mental state, in which the relational problems are usually a consequence of the disorder, like depression or a psychosis or some other disorder. And we've learned a lot about the development of personality disorder, and the headline is it's complex and multifactorial, and there's a very important role for this reciprocal interaction and a very strong influence of social, cultural, economic and historical mechanisms. There's a 6-fold higher treated incidence of personality disorder in low socioeconomic communities. And we know that symptoms and their expression are shaped by culture. We know that the global prevalence varies. It's lower in low and middle income countries. And we know that trends might be related, the trends in incidence might be related to the breakdown of social cohesion and social capital in modern societies. In a sense, our young might be the sentinel species for what is happening in our society. They are the warning sign for the social changes that are leading to the current rise in mental ill health. What we know also, though, is that reductionism is scientifically wrong and unjustified. You'll hear some people tell you it's all about trauma, it's all about attachment, it's all about emotion dysregulation, or it's all about abnormal brains or genes. None of these are correct. In fact, it is a much more complex and nuanced etiology. We know that developmental trauma is neither necessary nor sufficient for the development of personality disorder. In fact, 2/3 of Australians experience developmental trauma, yet only a very small percentage develop personality disorder. So why should we be concerned? Well, because actually about 10% of the population have mild and above personality disorder. About 3% of young people have severe personality disorder, about 1% of adults. And by age 24, about 1 in 5 people will have met the criteria for personality disorder, and about 1/5 of them will have had severe personality disorder. And we know that it is the 4th leading cause of burden of disease of all mental disorders. So it is an important form of mental ill health that has hitherto been ignored. We know that these problems commence in adolescence and young adulthood. It used to be that you couldn't diagnose it in young people. And you can see there the broad range of outcomes, of problems that people present with, but also of outcomes from this disorder. And it acts as a gateway to other disorders, and the family and friends of those people also struggle and have terrible experiences of mental health care. I mentioned that it's a gateway to the not just personal costs, but the social and economic costs of personality disorder, particularly employment and education outcomes, which are very poor among this group. You have 9 times greater likelihood of being unemployed or on disability support pension. It's a stronger predictor of disability support than anxiety or depression. And the high healthcare costs are a huge burden, of course, for society. Most tragically, the mortality is 10 times that of the general population for people in the first 5 years after they have been diagnosed with the disorder. And the life expectancy of people with severe personality disorder is reduced by 2 decades. Suicide rate is about 8 to 10%. That doesn't account for all the premature mortality. And sadly, it is the most stigmatised of all mental disorders, but not by you, the general public, actually by my colleagues. And it is still the whipping boy for people's frustrations and dissatisfaction. And people say things about people with personality disorder they would never dare say about any other patient presenting for care. And people perceive less of a sense of purpose in working with people with personality disorder. So we've learned a lot though. We know actually that treatment is effective. We know that medication is ineffective for personality disorder, and we know that early identification leads to earlier effective treatment. And we know that treatment for most people with personality disorder is actually not as complex as people have tried to tell us in the past. But we know that the people who most need treatment are rarely the people who get it. And we also know that treatment can harm, that many of the things we think about as being associated with personality disorder are actually harms perpetrated by the health system. So to conclude, personality disorder is a developmental disorder characterised by maladaptive self and interpersonal functioning. It begins from puberty and has its onset by young adulthood, like all of the other major mental disorders. It's strongly influenced by social, cultural, economic and historical mechanisms. It has very high potential to disrupt the successful transition to adulthood, and it has lifelong personal, social and economic consequences. We know that treatment is effective, access is very poor, and that the biggest barriers to reform are actually bigotry and sectarianism, not a lack of effective treatments. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That was incredibly interesting. We've now got the Honourable Dr. Andrew Leigh on video.
G'day, my name's Andrew Leigh, the Assistant Minister for Charities, and it's great to be speaking to you virtually at the Royal Society of New South Wales Learned Academies Forum. I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people. Daranuna, Daranunawal, Yungu, Nalamanyan, Dunimanyan, Ngunnawal-wari, Darawari, Dindi, Wangaralin-Jinyin. I acknowledge all First Nations people present and commit myself as a member of the government to the implementation in full of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which starts with voting yes on October the 14th. You've asked me to say a few words about the friendship recession that Australia finds itself in today, a challenge which is in its way as stark as any other that Australia confronts. Over the course of the past generation, we've seen Australians step back from engagement in formal community organisations. Membership as a share of the population in Scouts, Guides, Rotary, Lions has waned. We've seen a decline in the share of Australians playing an organised sport, with participation rates in sports such as cricket or football or netball declining. We've seen a decline in the share of Australians who are actively engaged in political movements, a drop in the share of people who cast a valid vote. And most troublingly, in the context of a friendship recession, we've seen a decline in the number of close friends that the typical Australian has. Back in the mid-1980s, surveys asked Australians, how many close friends do you have with whom you could share a confidence? And got answers around 10. Now the answer is around 5, meaning the typical Australian has shed half their close friends over the course of the past generation. Worryingly too, the share of people who say they have no close friends has declined over this period. This has occurred at a time when Australia has become more unequal, meaning that in both economic terms and social terms, we've moved from being a nation of we towards more of a country of me. Reconnecting Australia will involve a full court press, work from civil society, government, and from us as individuals acting together in our local communities. It might involve actions as straightforward as making sure that you're the one who welcomes the new neighbour into the street and puts on street drinks at the end of the year. My wife and I do it in our own street, and I've got to tell you, the time it takes is tiny and the benefits are immense. But we also need to inspire community organisations, to encourage Australians to join, participate and engage in local communities. As a government, we've set a target of doubling philanthropy by 2030. And we're working with the Productivity Commission to bring down a report on practical ways we might achieve that. A better connected Australia will be a more affluent Australia, because commerce works best when networks of trust and reciprocity are strong. It'll be a healthier Australia, because Australians tend to be fitter and have fewer mental health challenges when they're part of healthy communities. And it will be a happier nation, because friends are essential to living a good life. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today, and all the best for the conversations in your important forum.
And that was a wonderful setup for Jennifer Kent, who's going to talk about some of this.
Thanks very much, Pip, and it's great to be here today speaking with you. I also acknowledge that we're on the land of the Gadigal people, and as people before me, pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So you may be wondering, what on earth is somebody from a School of Architecture doing here speaking to you about the brain? Hopefully that will become clearer, but I do want to start by asking you to engage with two images that I'm about to show you. And I want you to think to which one you prefer. Which one draws you in? Which one takes you out of the mind that is so busy and so chatty and makes you focus on it? The two images, which I'll just put up again, and I want you to park that in the back of your mind. So as I said, what's somebody from architecture doing here speaking to you about the brain? The links between the way our cities are designed and planned are very multifarious, very complex, but I'm going to talk to two today, two specific ones. The first is that our cities can provide us with opportunities for connection to nature. The flora, the fauna, the waterways, the dirt that our cities are underpinned by. And the second is that our cities can provide us opportunities for connection to each other, for the people that work, live and play in the same spaces as us. The problem is our cities are densifying, and sometimes I wonder whether we're losing that responsibility as urban planners, designers and architects. So going back to the two images that I presented at the beginning, I'm going to hazard a guess that most of you were drawn in by the more natural image rather than the built one. Now, why do you think that is? Bringing it to life with colour now, you get more of a sense of an idea. Is it because the lines are more natural, they're curved? Is it because of the variations in shades? Research says that the main reason that we are more drawn to images like this is because of the unpredictability. The lines are unpredictable, the shades are unpredictable. And that gives us a slight sense of being able to get out of our own minds and focus on something else. It draws our mind into something that we can't necessarily predict and something that we need to engage with. And in that sense, nature in our everyday lives is a tiny snippet of an opportunity for mindfulness. And that's why it's so important for us to keep natural spaces, natural experiences within our urban environments. And how about social connection? Why are interactions so important when it comes to both our own functioning and our functioning as society? When we go back to it, social interaction, a sense of belonging, a sense of empowerment, a sense of being in the place where you live is at the foundations of things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But the person who really hammered this down for me was a guy called John Cacioppo from Chicago University. He talked about a hierarchy of interactions. Obviously, we start with our close family and our friends. That extends to friends that we catch up with from time to time. And then to our wider friendship group, the ones that we bump into at parties, the ones that we might see more often, but usually as part of a wider group. Then we have the people that we work with and the recreational equivalent, the people that we might see when we go to a football match, people who have very similar interests to us. The types of interactions, though, that I'm really interested in as a city planner, architect, urban designer, are the ones that we have day to day with the people who live with us, who attend the same spaces for shopping, for work, who go to the playgrounds, who we bump into day to day as we're walking our streets and getting by with our daily business. These are called incidental social interactions, and the research suggests that these are just as important for our mental health and well-being as the closer ties that we have. But furthermore, they're important for strong, connected societies because they bring us out of our own bubble and force us to connect to people that we might not otherwise meet with. But I wonder today, in the way that our cities are structured, whether we're facilitating that as well as we possibly could. How might we facilitate more social interactions, more positive social interactions in our cities that are increasing in population, increasingly densified, increasingly divided, and increasingly privatised? The way that we interact is changing. We all know that. We've spoken about devices already this morning. The problem with that is reinforcing our own bubble. It's reinforcing the echo chamber that becomes our networks as we have these complex algorithms that throw up ideas for connections that are seemingly not related to us but somehow all have the common theme. That's a very different experience than what we have when we're walking down the street and see people that are different from us in reality. And how can we do this in our cities? The first thing I'm going to talk about is this idea of talking points. These are places to talk and things to talk about. A famous sociologist and urban designer, William White, back in the 60s, said that the number one angle that architects never really think about is the angle of the human backside. The main thing that we can do to get people talking and interacting in everyday society is to give them a place to sit. What we're trying to do is encourage people to linger, to slow down and inhabit the place where they live, the places where they work, the places where they play. And to do that, we need to provide them places to linger. The provision of a simple park bench can be the catalyst to an interaction. And when I'm talking about these interactions, I'm not necessarily talking to striking up a conversation. I'm talking about the nod or the wave that you give to the same person who catches the 7:16 bus, or the little acknowledgement that you give to the lady that you pass each day as you walk up to get the paper. The smile that you might give a mother walking with her child in recognition that you've been there once. It's these incidental interactions that can really safeguard our mental health and provide a sense of belonging within our communities. The second thing is things to talk about. Now, obviously, we have the great works of public art that draw people to them. But it can be as simple as a tree in autumn where the leaves have turned orange, provoking a recognition alongside others that that is a beautiful thing to witness. A flock of birds flying across the sky, so noisy that it drowns out your conversation and again makes you look to the person near you and give them a smile. Those talking points in cities may seem minor, incidental, totally irrelevant from the main business of our cities of transporting, housing, and giving people places to work. But they are just as important for creating cities that are connected, where people feel like they belong. Often incidental interactions will occur when we're in spaces of transit. So they don't occur when we are in stasis, they occur when we're on the move. And our cities today are very much defined by private forms of transport. We rush through our suburbs in the safe cocoon of our private car rather than slowing to linger through walking or cycling to a place. We want that autonomy, that privacy, that cocoon, that sense of time out and the ability to get from A to B whenever we want in the fastest time possible, rather than taking the time to engage with our community, perhaps by slowing down, taking a bus, taking a train. These incidental interactions on the move are also important for building respect across community. But the way that we're planning and managing our cities at the moment, we are still extraordinarily car dependent. We pay lip service to the provision of public active transport networks. We still think of cycling as a recreational pursuit rather than, as they do in other countries around the world, as a way to get from A to B. And until we start to take the provision of those modes of transport seriously, we will continue to default to the privacy of the private car. Now, the second point that I wanted to draw on was the way that our cities can enable connection with nature. The provision of green, public open spaces in our cities is increasingly put at risk as we're taking up land more and more for the provision of housing, particularly in this housing affordability crisis where the mantra has just been develop, build this housing as quick as possible. In doing so, we don't want to erode the provision of public green open spaces for people. There's no point providing affordable housing if that affordable housing is poorly designed, if it doesn't contribute to the well-being of the population who one day has to inhabit it. Making sure that our green open spaces are both plentiful as well as well-designed is important. Making sure that they're safe places to be, that they're well shaded, that they're well lit at night, that they're well maintained, that they're responsive to the community that is expected to use them. We can also incorporate nature into smaller spaces within our urban environments. The use of verges for planting, the use of balcony gardens, wall gardens, rooftop gardens and so forth. The provision of spaces for community gardens, encouraging people to be out and about, interacting with each other as well as engaging with the love of growing your own food. It's also about the provision of spaces for people to keep companion animals. In our increasingly densified cities, that's becoming difficult. Over 40% of households in Australia own a dog, yet the majority of these households are in single detached dwellings with backyards. It's very difficult to own a dog or a cat when you live in a small unit, not least because the strata laws can sometimes have a blanket prohibition of that practice. Whereas we know that people who have companion animals do have better outcomes, including mental health outcomes. And, interestingly, societies where there are more companion animals do exhibit higher indices of connectivity and sense of belonging. But the more we build our cities up and out, the less likely it is that people will be keeping companion animals in a way that is tension-free and able to take advantage of the opportunities that they bring for connectivity. We need to provide people with spaces to take their dogs. We need to provide them with dog parks. And one of my favourite things, we need to enable them to travel around the cities in a way that is not car dependent. At the moment, keeping a dog in Sydney is a really car dependent affair. You can't go anywhere with the dog unless that you and the dog can walk that distance. Unlike most cities in Europe, some in North America, Melbourne, in Sydney, we're prohibited from taking our dogs on public transport. And that's just another little chink in the idea of having a convivial, open city. Now, of course, all of these spaces need to be tension-free. Of course, they require regulation and they require the community to come to the party in terms of understanding how to interact in these spaces. But we can do a lot more in cities like Sydney to help this to happen. Now, my final point is that this is not just all about social interactions. We also need to provide people with the opportunity to have time out. We're increasingly asking people to live their lives in public. We're asking people to live in smaller spaces, in apartments. We're asking people to travel in public modes. We're asking people to hot desk at their workplace. We're taking away opportunities for time out, for personalisation, for that sense of reflection. And the opposite side of the coin to social interaction is that time out. We won't have one without the other. And if our cities are not properly designed and managed to give people that opportunity to take some time out, we're going to discourage people from getting out and about and interacting in their community. So making sure that these apartment buildings that we're building are well designed, that they're livable, that they're big enough, that they have windows that can be opened and balconies that are pleasant to sit on. By making sure that our public transport systems allow people a sense of silence and privacy, as well as are predictable and comfortable and reliable. These are the things that we need to do to enable people to get out and about and take advantage of the rich interactions that a city like Sydney can bring. So thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to discuss anything further in one of the breaks.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. That was wonderful. And now Jackie Troy, who's, I think, going to deviate from her original plan and tell a personal story and reflection on the mind.
Naya Jackie, Naya Nyamichi Mutong, Naya Naragu. So I'm Jackie, I'm Naragu, and I'm from the Nyamich clan. Some of you would know Namaji National Park in Canberra, that area. So Snowy Mountains people. Ninari Nalawangun Maribadiri Gari Nurada. So today we are gathered here, we're sitting down, as the word Nalawangun says, on this beautiful country that belongs to the Gadigal, the clan group that were in this area and are still in this area, which is a great thing for all of us. All of Sydney has about 27 or so clan groups, many of them now known by their name, and I think that's something that is enriching everybody's lives. It's been very uplifting to hear people today acknowledging country and people. I don't see this as in any way tokenistic, And I'm really glad that it's continuing in spite of the sort of barrage of ridiculous rubbish and non-communal nonsense that's come about as a result of this recent referendum. I had a catastrophic loss as well in the last few weeks. My husband died at a young age from stage 4 lung cancer. Actually, it was the complications from that, as you'd probably know, that usually take people out. And what happened was it was his beautiful mind decided enough was enough. And I could see that process happening. So that's one of the things I will talk about today, because I want to knit it into my own sense as an Aboriginal person of community and what it means to be forever part of a community and forever part of the world, even when you're physically gone. So as I was listening just now, looking across to this beautiful tree to lift my mood a little, I want to tell you, and you will never look at a Moreton Bay fig ever the same way again. So that beautiful Moreton Bay fig that is inhabited by our cousins, a family of Kookaburra who've been feeding each other, grooming each other and doing all sorts of other things that birds do at this time of year to create more little kookaburras. The fig tree is actually inhabited by a spirit, and he has enormous burras, as we say, testicles, that he bounces around on and clangs together. We've been hearing a clock chiming, and I was thinking to myself, maybe he's somewhere around here. So I'm telling you this not just for I guess, some light relief, but also because that's how we as Aboriginal people perceive the world. Everything has a life force, everything has its own personality, if you like, its own brain. So I'm looking at you, neuroscience people. And also we are part of everything. I was sitting with my colleague Hans Pols, and we were musing about what's missing from the conversation, but you brought them in, thank you. Our friends, furred, feathered, scaled, chirping, whatever, who are actually, from an Aboriginal point of view, from an Indigenous point of view, worldwide actually, our family and our friends. So the trees are our ancestors, the birds are our cousins, brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles, family, you know, and they all have an interaction with us all the time. And I think that enriches our Indigenous minds in a way that, unfortunately, a lot of the rest of the world, the Western world, we often characterise it as, have impoverished themselves by not engaging. So yes, I agree with you. It's about bloody time we're able to take our pets, as we call them, wherever, but they're our family members. I think I'm going to be struggling to take the horses on the train, but they'll give it a shot. I have seen people take horses up in elevators, but there you go. I do want to also talk about how it is for Aboriginal people in Australia. Our session is about the increasing complexity of our lives, and we've heard earlier about how technology, meaning tablets. Sorry, I've got some great technology here. It's a book and paper and a pen. You know, now when that sort of thing became common usage, it's only a few hundred years ago, really. I mean, the first printed books, you know, that was considered the work of the devil and extremely shocking. So I gave my child what she learnt to read playing Pokemon, actually. It's really good. It's a very complex language in that she struggled a lot with reading at school and writing, but at home she was doing very complex things using, you know, technology that she was engaging with. So I like to engage with technology. As an Aboriginal person, I weep that we are now technologically and intellectually impoverished. So in 1788, when England invaded right here at Waran, and took most of Australia gradually and then increasingly rapidly, they also took most of our 407 languages. All of you, everybody, you've lost 407 languages. There are about 15 languages that are still strong, but none of you would know any of them, I think, except Diane Eads, who's in our audience today and is a great linguist as well of Australian languages. So how do you feel about that? 407 languages. Those languages are not related to any other languages in the world. They're extraordinary languages. And they are so complex that you can say everything you need to say, everything I've just said, in a lot less of an utterance. A few short sentences you could say, to use a twee English description of grammar. You know, I've just said to you a whole lot. When I said I'm Ngarigu, immediately for my community that evokes all the things that it is about being Ngarigu. I don't have to say anything much else. I don't have to explain anything. This is because our communities knew each other, still do, but we can't use our languages. Only 15 languages are still really strong. We're renewing most of them. That's the good news. You will have your 407 languages back soon. I'm looking forward to that. But so, you know, this kind of loss of everything that language gives you, we've heard about that today. Connectivity. Oh, we didn't ever care about writing systems, sorry. Literacy is just not a thing in the Indigenous world. I mean, you know, you can get by without it. So, but we have embraced digital literacies because they're so much more interesting. For a start, they've got lots of visuals, which is good. So, you know, we have also taken our extremely highly developed technological kit, right? An Aboriginal person could get through a day with a sharpened stick, basically, something to carry a few things in, and being very physically fit, but also all that deep knowledge held in their brains about everything to do with everything around them, and no need to carry any aide-memoire. That was just, we knew what we were doing. I once had a friend from the Western Desert say to me that by the time a child is 4 years old in his area, they are a complete socio-economic unit. They're able to go out and hunt something, kill it, prepare it, and feed other people. And that's a 4-year-old child. That would be a horror. Imagine sending a child from any Sydney family here out, okay, you go catch yourself a lizard, bring it back, cook it up, and feed grandma. Yeah, that's just not going to happen. I mean, even, light a fire. What? No. You know, we now have all these safe spaces for kids, and that probably wouldn't include doing any of that. So, you know, we've taken this kind of, I guess, understanding of how to live well in country, as we say, with everything in it, over the last 65,000 at least. That's the archaeological record suggests. Actually, it's 72,000 years now, the oldest sites where people were preparing food and living well up in the north of Australia. And people are suggesting now 120,000 years. I've often said to people when they say, well, you know, but you've got no like big structures, or you didn't have a wheel, or, you know, none of these things. And I say to people, well, we spent, you know, we'll say 120,000 years developing ourselves as very complex social beings. We have in our languages ways of dealing with everything. So just as again, back for a little light relief, mothers-in-law and sons-in-law never talk to each other directly in most Australian languages. Genius. Imagine all the social dissonance that we would be without if that was, you know, practiced more widely. So, but, you know, just to get through an average day, people would speak at least 9 languages. There's child language, and I mean actual child language, not just, you know, actually speaking to children in their own language. People would use ceremonial languages, love magic languages. That one I think would be interesting to explore, don't you think? So it comes from the brain, not the heart. We actually know there is a brain. Aboriginal people are very aware of that. Although most things happen from the stomach, the kidneys too. So those other organs, the heart's kind of irrelevant. So, you know, there's all these sort of ways of engaging with each other that we've lost, frankly, and we're trying to get it back. It will never be what it was. In a short space of time, just over 200 years, we've lost so much. All of you have lost so much because of what's happened here. But we can engage with it, and that's part of what I've been doing as a linguist and anthropologist for a long time now. I have we're doing presenting our students. So I'm going to name my student Mujahid Tawali from northwest Pakistan, who's from Swat. When I was first going there, all I knew was Pakistan is terrifyingly full of terrorists, and that area is particularly bad, but very interesting, great Indigenous languages, so I must go there. Sydney University was like, you definitely are not. That is a red zone, and there are genuine terrorists there. Well, when I went there, sadly I met not a single terrorist, but I actually met people who I could template my indigeneity directly onto their indigeneity, and I just fit it in. I've even had people saying, I'm a mountainy Indigenous person, they're mountainy Indigenous people, and people have said to me there, oh, you're just so like a Kohistani woman, you're just so much like our people. Well, that's because we have this whole other world, an Indigenous world, that I would really love more people to engage with. We've heard a lot today about researchers saying, engage with our research. I think if we could just engage a lot more with Aboriginal Australia and Torres Strait Islander peoples as well, this country would be actually solving, I think, some of the questions raised in other research areas. We are different. A lot of what was said this morning fits really nicely with a Western, Anglo-centric, English language-centric point of view, but it doesn't really fit or sit comfortably with me, frankly. And I don't think it does with my colleague Mujahid either, who's working with his community, who've only had a writing system for about 10 years, and that's because they invented one themselves. But it's still not very relevant for most of the community. I should say I share that student with Ian Hickey. So thank you to our work in Afghanistan. So I'll just quickly move on to, I guess, a personal experience I had recently, as I said, with the death of my husband. So he was a systems engineer, a top systems engineer, an electronics engineer. He was Indigenous Irish. He struggled with that idea of being Indigenous and Irish because the British also invaded Ireland about 600 years ago. And in the last few months he said to me, I think I'm dying from trauma. And I said, really? And he said that the cancer is caused by trauma. And I thought, gosh, he has had a tough life, and I said, trauma? And he said, yes, the English invading Ireland. Cancer in Ireland is really high. We're all really stressed about it. And I still remember him saying, when I first met him, and he was age 22, that fucking Cromwell. And I'm like, Cromwell, is that a band I've never heard of? And he meant Oliver Cromwell. So here's this 22-year-old Irish man talking about the atrocities committed on his people. It was that much still in his brain. So there's this kind of communal grief, like we have in Australia as Aboriginal people, about the things that have happened to us and our communities. We suffer from these sort of micro-traumas constantly that lead to terrible disorders like PTSD. I've experienced that myself. And Podrick struggling to articulate being Indigenous because it was such a bad thing to be in Ireland. You were a culture, they were still using those terms, meaning an outsider, a non-person, a bad person, for being Irish, Indigenous Irish, from the Gaeltacht, from the Irish-speaking areas. But in the end, his approach, while he worked closely with Lifehouse, I have to say Michael Boyer, Ian intervened and helped me to get Michael Boyer as Podrick's doctor, and Chris Milros. They worked with him like the system engineer he was. He treated his illness as a problem. Mission critical, I think he would call it, because he dealt with extremely complex defence system matters and things. Mission critical is where it can't go down. The system can't go down. So his system was not to go down until he took it down. And so he worked with his doctors in this clinical way. So I have thought a lot about what I was going to talk a bit about today was AI and how AI might engage with communicative systems. So with Australian Indigenous languages, I do wonder how the complexity of our languages and the fact that they're not related to any other languages in the world will engage with AI. At the moment, that's not happening. People have approached me about it, but I think it would be an interesting thing to do. But Podrick and I talked a lot about AI and where it was heading, and he said, there will be a human-like brain that will develop in the not too distant future. and he had access to information that, you know, he felt very strongly that this is where we were heading, that you would have some way of creating something that could cognise in the way that humans did. And he kind of held fast to this idea that technology and systems could actually carry us through into a future, and even carry him through what he was going through, systems. But in the end, the system failed and the human stepped in. And it was his indigeneity, my indigeneity, his other friends, including Mujahid, who stepped in around him and wrapped around him and created the human environment, the empathetic, the caring, the randomly emotional, the things that no system can really replicate. I mean, it's actually a fact that everything everybody says is the first time anyone's ever said it, and it will never be said again. I know that sounds extraordinary, but that's how human language is. But machines rely on replicating things that have been said. They may have a massive and thought and experienced. None of us can actually, they have, you know, massive databases that you can feed into AI systems, but they're always flawed. They're always a little bit blurred. There's pretty usually 10 fingers on one hand instead of the other hand looks normal, but this one's just a bit weird. You know, there's always that bit of weirdness. Now, humans are a bit like that too. And I saw that as Podrick was failing. There were things shutting down about his cognition. But one thing he could never do was imagine his own death. No human can imagine what it is to be dead, because we will never have that experience. Once you're dead, the brain is stopped. That's why they turn the machinery off. So we can't share that experience. No one has ever shared what it is to be dead, and no one ever will. So humans live in this space of hope and imagination, a kind of world that Indigenous people populate with the beyond the death. In our beyond the death, you become part of everything that ever was. That just sounds like good science, doesn't it? You know, so we say that people become part of the stars. Well, we now know, thanks to, what's that fabulous English guy who does, you know, we are all stardust one way or another. But we have said this. Look up, my grandmother said to me, look up when I'm gone and you will find me. That's the star. And when there's a shooting star, that's a person returning. Well, it's stardust, it's matter. So I guess where I would like to end is to say that there are other ways of thinking about the world and the human mind, and that Indigenous people have a particularly different way of thinking about the world and the human mind. And every time I travel to another community, I find commonalities, but I also find new and startlingly, interestingly different things about how people understand the world and then communicate it. And I'd like to see more of that brought into our broader thinking as scientists, so that it is not such a Eurocentric and Anglo and dominant language-centric way of sharing scientific knowledge and focusing on the kind of research that we do that focuses on these sort of, I guess, non-Indigenous ways of thinking. So I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie, for that incredibly rich and reflective analysis, and a very courageous one too, so thank you very much. David, our last speaker.
So I'm here to circle back and talk about disorders, mental disorders, and the whole idea of whether we should be thinking in terms of dealing with mental disorders as such. And I'm doing it slidelessly because I've been persuaded by a bit of evidence that people's comprehension is actually reduced by audiovisual presentations, except when they're critical, like you need some diagrams or you need some photographs. So slideless today. So what's the story? Well, my story is going to be that there is no useful fundamental category of disorder. But that's not to say that there aren't disorders. It's just to say that there's nothing in common between things that get called disorders that is deep and fundamental, and that this is going to play some kind of role in how we should think about mental health interventions. What I'm not going to talk about is all the particular reasons, kind of pragmatic reasons why you might not want to talk about disorders. the idea that disorders are stigmatising, or perhaps they're not. Perhaps to some they're helpful because it's good to have a label on how you are and how you're feeling. I'm not going to talk about how particular diagnoses might be bad because they result in uniform treatment for a wide range of underlying behaviours. I'm not going to talk about how disorder might be a bad notion because it leads to simple, monocausal, biological, reductive explanations of the kind that Andrew rightly told us we should be very worried about. And I'm not going to talk about the ways in which diagnosis of a disorder might make someone act out the very symptoms that the disorder allegedly has. These are things which may be true, may be false. But the thing is, if there really were a fundamental category of disorder underneath all of this, then we would ignore it at our peril, because we ignore fundamental joints in nature at our peril, if there are any. So it makes the question, is the idea of a disorder a fundamental joint in nature, a pressing one and an important one? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about two different kinds of ways you might think that there are such fundamental joints, that disorder is a real category that plays an important role. One is kind of biological, to see if there's a biological notion of disorder, which is kind of profound and reliable and repeatable. And the other is sociocultural, to see if there's a kind of a constructed notion of disorder, which plays those kind of roles too. And then I'm going to say that there's neither of these two, and so there is no good account of disorder, and that either means we need to pretend there are disorders, because that's a good thing to do, or we need to move beyond it. So, let's do the biological one first. There are lots of different attempts. I'll just describe one and why I think it fails, and this is based on some work by myself and many of my colleagues, a couple of my colleagues at Sydney University. And that's that there's a very natural way to go, which is derived perhaps from Aristotle. I mention his name only because I want to be a stereotype philosopher and mention a dead philosopher's name. It's a good thing to do, right? And that's to think that what's going on with a disorder is that a disorder is a disordered state because it's not doing what it's meant to do. It's not fulfilling its function. And so what you need then, if you think that a disorder is something not doing what it's meant to do, is a biological notion of what things are meant to do. Now that can seem very intuitive in some cases. So think about your heart. What does your heart do? It does lots of things, right? It exerts a small amount of pressure on your toes. It makes a little bumpity noise. It exerts an extremely small gravitational attraction on Jupiter. I think I once calculated that Jupiter is 10 to the minus 57 metres closer than it would be if I didn't have a heart. That's, of course, well, I won't bore you with whether it's possible to have distances that small or not because of the Planck length. The other thing the heart does is pumps blood. And if I were to do a little poll here and ask you which one do you think it's for, which do you think is the purpose of the heart, pumping blood or applying pressure on your toes, I'm assuming that most of you will raise your hands and say pumping blood. Well, why? Why is it a purpose? Why are there biological purposes if there are? Well, for Aristotle, the world was full of natural purposes. We lived in a purposeful world. But not many of us think that way now. Perhaps if you're not just a theist, but also the kind of theist that thinks that, God had a great big sketch pad and she planned out all of our organs in detail and thought, I know what that thing's for, I'm designing it for this purpose, just like someone might make a screwdriver for a purpose. If you think that intention in that kind of way can underwrite biological purpose, then maybe you're fine. But unless you have that particular brand of theism, it's not going to work. So where are we going to get our purposes from if we don't have deliberating agents with purposes designing things for a purpose? Well, once again, many stories. But perhaps the most common one is one which says that purpose here comes from what things were evolved for. You ask yourself, why is this thing here? So why do I have a heart? What explains the fact that we all have hearts, that organisms have hearts? Is it that it made a noise and that those noises were useful for attracting mates? Is it because it applied pressure on our toes? Is it because it's kind of handy to distribute oxygenated materials around the body so your body can become larger and more complex? Very plausibly the last thing, so perhaps the function of the heart is indeed to pump blood, and it malfunctions when it fails to pump blood, and you end up dead. Okay, is that a good account of biological function? Perhaps it is. I think it's the kind of account of function which makes sense when say a paleozoologist picks up a fossil and says, what's this bit of the animal for? It's very peculiar, they want to know. And perhaps what they want to know is how it got there, why it got there, what it did that got it there. But I don't think that this sort of story is much use at all in thinking about disorder, either medical in general or psychological in particular. Now, why is this? Well, a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's just much too easy to make up evolutionary explanations of things. Actually getting them right is incredibly hard, and we mostly won't get there. Here's something you don't want. You don't want to go along to Andrew and say, please treat me, and you don't want him to say, come back in 20 years when I've worked out exactly what the neural states underlying your behaviour are and what their purpose is, and once I've figured that out, only then will I know it's a disorder, right? You don't want that, that's not a good idea. So that's one reason why this sort of story is not going to be a goer. The second is lots of paradigm disorders just aren't disorders in this sense. So anything which of the malfunctions, psychological or physical, of old age aren't going to count as disorders because there's not much evolutionary pressure in old age. You've done your reproducing, whatever happens to you then has pretty much no effect on how many offspring you're going to have. So all those disorders of old age can't be things which have a function where the function is failing, because that sort of pressure is just not really there to some extent. And the last is that lots of things we think of as disorders, and especially cases of psychological disorders, are things which are perfectly functional in this sense. Things which are doing exactly what they were evolved for, but just in the current environment, it's actually biting you in your ass very badly. So one example, a semi-psychological case, is the story that, which may not be true, it's controversial, that there are populations which have got a much stronger desire to eat fatty substances. Why? Because for many thousands of years those populations were in extremely fat-poor environments, and this was massively adaptive for them to do so. But of course in a contemporary environment it's catastrophic. It leads to obesity and early death. Maybe dementia is not any kind of a problem or any kind of a disorder on these sorts of stories of disorder. So these sorts of stories about disorder are not ones that are looking very promising. So if that kind of account of what a disorder is not going to work, and you just have to take it on trust that competing slightly similar ones don't seem to be very promising either. I've only got 12 minutes and I don't know how many I've got left. What else might we do? We might go for a socially constructed account of a disorder. We might say, look, we don't need a fundamental biological story. What we need is a story about how we respond to the world and what kinds of things we think of as disorders. So a team I work with, mainly in Denmark, partly here in Sydney, has done some work on trying to find out what sorts of things elicit the response in people of that's a disorder. So this is Andrew Lathan, Samoj Varga and I at the University of Aarhus. And so what we did was we took a sample of people and we looked at various variables that might correlate with people's judgments that something was a disorder. And here are 4 that we did in one study. One of them is patient valuation. This was a case of sexual disorders, by the way. Patient valuation, how much does the patient mind or care about the behaviour they've got, or how much do they not mind? Another is community evaluation. How much do we as a community care about other people exhibiting these behaviours or not care about them exhibiting those behaviours? The other is the source. How much of this behaviour comes, it seems, from primarily heritable things not very responsive to the environment, and how much is the behaviour very responsive to the environment? And finally, the intensity or strength of the behaviour. All those characteristics turn out to play a role in some way or other, and they interact in various ways. But it's a complete mess. It is entirely unpredictable and entirely unstable. Different people make different judgments. Different people make different judgments even when, for example, they're all psychiatrists, or all clinical psychologists, or all doctors, or all just regular Danes. The one thing I should say is they're all Danes. So this might be something about Danes, although I doubt it. Now, I haven't definitively proved then that there's no coherent thing we're responding to when we ask about disorders, but once again, I think it's not looking good. So, if it's not looking good to think about what a disorder is from a biological perspective, And it's not looking good to think about what a disorder is from a kind of socially constructed, responding to behaviours perspective. What should we do? Problem is that disorder plays a crucial role in our society. It plays a kind of, I think of it as a kind of rationing role, right? Medical and psychological services are rationed according to whether you've got a disorder. In the medical case, if you go along to a doctor and say, look, my nose is ugly, I want Medicare to give me some plastic surgery, the answer will probably be no, because that doesn't count as a disorder. If you have a child and you want your child who's doing extraordinarily well at school to do even better, and you want to hire a bunch of educational psychologists to intervene, you're not going to get funded because disorder is playing some kind of role here. If we decide that disorder is not the category that we want to use, we're going to have to come up with some other way of rationing. It seems, this is highly controversial to believe me, but it seems right to me that public funding should not be prioritised towards cosmetic surgery. And it seems right to me that public funding should not be prioritised towards interventions to make people who are already happy much happier, or make people who are already learning very well learn even better. I mean, obviously it'd be great to have those people do that, but it's not a priority for public funding. So what would you have to do? You have to kind of think about the whole rationing question in a much more deliberate way. If we can't just default onto this simple notion of, is it a disorder or not? Is it an illness that needs to be fixed, or is it just giving people what they want? Because if the key idea ends up being, in the case of psychological disorder, what you're trying to do is give resources to improve people's psychologies, to make their psychologies more the way they want them to be, then you're going to have to make these serious rationing decisions. And how will you do that? I suppose there are equity considerations. Maybe it's unfair to give someone who's already flourishing resources to make them flourish more compared to someone who's not flourishing or in a very bad way. Maybe if there are communities where everyone is not flourishing psychologically for reasons for which we share a kind of collective responsibility. So maybe resources need to go there. Maybe we need to think about what sort of interventions will make the society as a whole work better rather than thinking about the fairness on the individuals. I don't know how any of this is going to work or should work, but I do think it's something that we really need to start thinking hard about. How to equitably distribute psychological interventions in creative and helpful ways that won't rely just on some default notion like disorder. Thanks.
Thank you, David, for that wonderful provocation. I hope there's lots of questions for our panel, our diverse panel. We've had a romp through the social sciences. Yeah, Tony.
Andrew, can you say more about treatment and management?
Thank you. Essentially, the treatment of personality disorder has been the realm of psychotherapists for a very long time. And actually, I'm just over here from the International Personality Disorder Conference, which is up the road. And a lot of the debate is around what actually constitutes treatment. And actually, my argument has been the complexity of treatment has been oversold, that people have focused on old-fashioned notions of individual psychotherapy, sitting in a room one-to-one for an hour a week and expecting that to generalise to people's lives outside of the consulting room. And actually, a lot of the research now shows that basic building blocks of treatment are in fact attending to being problem-focused. People with personality disorder have educational and vocational problems. They have housing instability. They have physical health problems. They are among the highest consumers of cigarettes, alcohol and other drugs. And actually attending to many of the practical problems is far more effective in terms of outcomes than actually the individual talking therapies. That's not to say that the talking therapies are not effective, but they are complex and difficult to implement at scale for a problem that, even if you just took people with severe, I won't use the word disorder, severe problems, that would be about 3% of young people, about 1% of adults. And so actually being less constrained about what we mean about treatment, but being evidence-based about what is effective is really where I think things are headed. And so I think the good news story is it's not as difficult as people will tell you it is.
Neuroscientists have not cured any disease, but they are not altogether useless. They have found things that predispose you to postponing dementia, and one of which is exercise. And your cities that you mentioned, cycling, walking, running, or if it were available, swimming, rowing, assist you in preserving your brain. If not to save the environment, the earth, at least to postpone dementia and be able to interact if you walk, as you say, because one of the three most important factors for postponing dementia besides exercise and diet is the associations as you form. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I didn't get to touch on the whole realm of the way our cities impact health, but their ability to foster physical activity is a really important component, particularly because they have the ability to foster incidental physical activity. So that is physical activity that's linked to something else. And we all know that when we've got a physical activity that's linked to, for example, the need to get from A to B, we're more likely to keep it up over time. So we've engineered out physical activity of our cities, and it's time to engineer it back in again, purely for the reason that it's good for our health. If you can combine that with some social interaction, you know, all the better. Community gardens, cycling, walking, etc.
More questions? Yes, there's a few there and there.
Hi, my name's Pattison. I was really interested in the comments that you were making around order and disorder. And in the 70s, when I was wrestling with apartheid South Africa, I read Richard Sennett's book, The Uses of Disorder. I don't know if it's a book you know. How would we reinterpret Sennett today in our Australian setting, if you know that book, or even if you don't know the book? How would you radically disrupt our order in order to reorder us?
That's a very good question. And I think that the only way to reconstruct a notion of order is to reconstruct a notion based on, as it were, what we want, both individually and collectively. So the goal should not be to look for, you know, the one true account of what order is and then achieve that, or the one true account of disorder is and trying to avoid that. But ask ourselves, how do we want ourselves to be as people? How do we want our society to be? And then move towards that. And then if you want to call that order, you can. If you just want to call it what your goals are, that will do just as well.
Can I make I was just going to say, I've been thinking one of the things I wanted to say that I didn't was that in Indigenous communities, the idea of being disabled or mentally unwell or tends actually not to even really be raised. People just, everybody lives together and you don't put people somewhere where somebody else is caring for them, or in a facility where a whole lot of people with similar, you could say, characteristics. People actually engage very actively with, I guess, the diversity. So the idea of order and disorder, I don't think translates very well into, particularly into Indigenous languages, if, you know, thinking about them classically. And the other thing I was going to say is that, you know, mental health and well-being is really supported by this communal way of thinking about health. And if you are an individual being diagnosed as an Aboriginal person, this is a big problem in our health system, is that we have such a focus on the individual, you know, back to a sort of Western way of doing things, that you actually need to diagnose people collectively within the community. And there's a lot of quite good research, but it's small quantity of research, and about, you know, looking at people as part of a whole, rather a societal whole, rather than just the individual.
Hi, I've got another question mainly aimed at Jennifer. So thank you for that talk and to the panel for all your great talks. In terms of the sort of urban planning and opportunities there's a lot of new suburbs and built-up areas in Sydney, and I don't know your opinion, but it'd be great to hear what your thoughts are there, if that's an opportunity for Sydney, to put some of these practices in place, and what the role of different parts of our society are in there, whether it's for government or for community. It'd be great to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, we've done some pretty awful things when it comes to the greenfield developments, in particular in Sydney. The way that we've just continued the fairly homogenous single detached dwelling urban form is drawing into the problems that I've been mentioning rather than overcoming them. But we've also done some pretty good work when it comes to infill development within existing suburban areas, which is what we need to do. We cannot in Sydney keep developing outwards. We've already taken away the majority of the arable lands of the Sydney Basin, eroding our ability to have a locally grown food source. We're encroaching onto bushfire-prone lands, floodplains and so forth. So we can't keep doing what we've been doing in terms of greenfield development on the outskirts. The fix is going to be looking at our infill development, and what I think we've done wrong there is we've gone high-rise in what's called transit-oriented developments around train stations and so forth, where you've seen, Chatswood, Parramatta, Sydney Olympic Park, Macquarie Park, Epping. I can just roll off the list. They were all targeted as these urban development precincts where they were having quite high-rise. Now, that is not so good for people's health either, because there's a lot of aspects of living in really higher density areas that are not supportive of mental health. What we haven't done, and I feel like this is a common theme that's just run through all of our talks, is look at the middle ground, the mess in between it all, and try and work things out on a case-by-case basis. Having some townhouses, some duplexes, some medium-rise developments, some single lot detached dwellings. That's where we need to go if we're going to kind of solve this mess that we have at the moment. But I think, if I can just sort of wrap up and say, we all need to stop looking for single kind of homogenous solutions to things. We need to engage with the messiness of what it is to be the human condition. And that applies to our cities just as much as it applies to the way we think about these things through philosophical notions, just as much as it applies to a diagnosis. And I think if we can do that and embrace the mess and become more proficient at that and not be scared to do it, that's when we're going to start to really move forward with some of the things that we've been talking about.
What a great point to end on. And yes, please thank the panel. And I believe lunch is served.